border now. The two women who were killed and found dismembered in Juarez on Sunday were from El Paso.
On the southern border, there is a legal concept known as reasonable fear, a lifeline for those fleeing violence.
A Texas couple was found tortured and murdered.
Police say so far this month, 11 women have been killed in Juarez.
And then their bodies or body parts offered up to Santa Muerte as an offering. She represents death.
In this special Borderland docuseries, I take a deep dive onto true crime stories. Join me as we uncover the truth about the fear behind the crisis.
This was a group of powerful people.
Never been seen before in Mexico.
Evidence of ritualistic elements.
We ended up rescuing almost 200 kids.
The discovery of multiple women in mass graves.
They're almost in every state.
When you put it together, you have an economic extortion map.
But even more violent.
The biggest money launderers in the world right now in drugs in this side of the world are Chinese organized criminal groups working for the cartels. Okay, so the days of just being suppliers of precursor chemicals, yes, they do that at scale. But now they are more and more the biggest money launderers in the world.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of IRONCLAD, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an IRONCLAD original. My next guest is Ray Donovan, a retired DEA agent whose last position was the Chief of Operations. He has extensive knowledge on China's connection to the Mexican cartels and their smuggling network. I'm excited for you guys to hear this one. Well, Ray, thank you so much for joining us on the Borderland podcast. I'm excited about this because of the article that I got to read, but as well as your current kind of like expertise in the China smuggling situation. We've had several podcasts with experts that kind of touch on that, but I think today I'm really excited about learning more. If you wouldn't mind for our audience, give a brief bio of yourself.
Sure. So April of 23, I retired as the Chief of Operations for the DEA. And before that, I was the special agent in charge for New York City, New York State. Before that, I was the special agent in charge of the Special Operations Division. And before that, I was in the SOD, or Special Ops Division, really just coordinating global investigations on international, transnational criminal groups. Before that, I spent 15 years in the New York Drug Enforcement Task Force, where I honed my skill and became an expert in going after Mexican cartels.
One of the things I have to mention here is that you led the 2015 operation to apprehend El Chapo. Is that correct?
Yeah, I always say this about El Chapo, that it was a team effort. And so it was a group of people that from various agencies that came together and really put our egos aside and decided to share all of our intelligence. And we managed, after about 2 years of work, we managed to, identify Chapo's inner circle, eventually leading to his capture. And then once he escaped in July of 2015, we put that team back together. And within 6 weeks, we were tracking him again in Mexico, working very closely with the Mexican Marines. And in fact, the second capture, I say it was done primarily by the Mexican Marines. They got very skilled at becoming an investigative force, not just military force. And it was actually their strategy to push him down from the mountains of Sinaloa into Los Mochis. And so credit is due to many agencies, both in Mexico and the United States, and a lot of hard work over about a 4-year period of time.
That's an incredible case, and it's such a huge impact in the cartels when that happened. Obviously, just recently, El Mayo was also, I don't know how to say whether he was captured or he turned himself in, or there's a lot of confusion on how that goes. But that's another significant case that has kind of disrupted or also caused a rift in the cartel systems down in Mexico. But the biggest focus I wanted to kind of hit today is, we've had other experts talk about that, but for me, it's like the relationship between Mexico and China and how that started.
Right.
I think knowing how that started, and then we could get into all the other pieces, but how did that, do you know how that got initiated originally?
Yeah, so you got to understand something, Vince, about like Chinese organized crime and their role in drug trafficking. They are way upstream, right? So obviously the chemical production is a big deal. And in regards to Mexico, you got to go back to the 90s, even before that, when methamphetamine started getting manufactured in Mexico. So all those chemicals for meth production were coming from China. So they had a foothold early on in Mexico, supplying the pseudoephedra, the monomethylamines, and methylamines, the precursors to produce methamphetamine. But it didn't create the same wave, right, that fentanyl did when fentanyl hit in the United States. It changed and transformed the market in the United States. Prior to that, the market was really driven by gangs and biker gangs, and methamphetamine was. Once the Mexican cartels started mass producing super labs of methamphetamine, it really changed meth production all throughout the Western Hemisphere, in particular Mexico and the United States. So the Chinese had a foothold from that, being the suppliers early on, right? So going back into late 80s, 90s.
I guess the next thing is kind of this. When we discuss China and China's involvement in the smuggling, and the exploitation of America's borders, to what extent is this strategy potentially the Chinese government themselves, or is this kind of rogue elements in the Chinese government that or a criminal organization? Because I think there's a confusion there. When you say China, people think the Chinese government is planning this, its strategy. Yeah. Is it, or is it organizations that are doing that?
I think it's a combination of both. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So there are chemical companies that are owned by the PRC, right? Literally, they are owned by the PRC, and they are exporting large amounts, large quantities of not only precursor chemicals for fentanyl and meth production, but also pure fentanyl to the United States and to Mexico for transport into the United States. The PRC, there's about 160,000, this is a State Department number, 160,000 chemical companies throughout China. It's one of the most unregulated industries in China. And there's literally tens of thousands of sub-brokers in China, right? So you can have a massive production plant and have hundreds of brokers that are buying chemicals from that plant or that company, and then brokering deals back into the United States and back into Mexico as well. So it is a combination of both, Vince, right? So we have seen where you have CCP that they sit on executive boards of some of these really prolific chemical companies that are just sending many, not just fentanyl, but many Schedule I drugs into the Western Hemisphere, in particular the United States. We've seen PRC and CCP would give grants and give other award money to chemical companies. The biggest factor, the number one factor in all of this, is that we know that the PRC and CCP gives tax rebates to chemical companies to export fentanyl derivatives all throughout the world, but in particular, United States and Mexico, up to 13%. So when you say, is this a government thing versus a criminal element within China? It's really both, right? It's really both, right? And let me elaborate on that a little bit more. When COVID hit in 2020, or early 2020, and Wuhan was locked down in China, we saw an immediate impact here in Mexico and the United States. So the drugs were starting to get stockpiled, movement and flow, logistics slowed down, and the prices of illicit drugs were going up everywhere nationally. So we know that the production of fentanyl in China is a direct correlation to distribution, trafficking and distribution in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting to know that the Chinese government definitely knows that there is, or almost knows and in support of this illicit drug getting transferred over to Mexico, or even It kind of goes to show it's almost an idea or a strategy of weakening our own government.
I think it's a combination, and I'll explain this too. There's so much revenue. There's so much revenue. You look at the Chinese government right now. I'm not an expert on their economy, but by no means. But I'll say this: we know that exports production is the key staple to the Chinese economy, and one of their biggest exports, and they really lead the world in this, is chemicals. And so, the more they are exporting, the more revenue they're generating for China. So there's that piece of it too, right? Does it undermine our society? Yes. Right? Does it disrupt our own economy through black market currency and the moving dark money? Absolutely, it does. I do think it's a combination now.
Yeah, it also almost weakens us internally by creating more addicts and also losing lives to the addiction of fentanyl. One of the questions I asked my last guest was, what does China or China and Mexico, the relationship between each other, what do they get out of it? Does China get to destabilize America slowly? The cartel makes money, or is there a more layered and nuanced approach to what they're doing?
Well, I think there is. I mean, if you look at Mexico has a role to play in the drug trafficking. Yes, we are focused on China production, but I don't know if you know this, Vince, but I testified before Congress back in April of this year, and I laid out 5 areas that are really kind of areas to focus in on, production in China being one of them, the open ports in Mexico, right? The seaports, Mazatlan, Veracruz, Manzanillo, the labs, the clandestine labs that are real throughout Mexico, obviously the border, and then I talked about social media platforms. So there's key areas where not only Mexico or China, but the United States, in particular in regards to social media platforms, right? We know that is now the vehicle for distribution nationally, right?
Really?
So, yes.
Which platforms are those? If you don't, sorry.
Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, like you name it. We see distribution taking place on encrypted applications like Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp. We see funding mechanisms like Cash App, Zelle, Venmo being utilized. So the drug trafficking distribution has evolved too. So our role as Americans, we need to do something about that to safeguard all these people that are succumbing to drug overdoses and poisoning. The other area is the border. And the cartels take full advantage of the border, right? So a group goes here, they'll send drugs the other way, or they'll build tunnels, distract and overcome. That's what they do, and they'll just keep on pushing. Now, they also push a lot of drugs directly through the ports of entry. And CBP does a fantastic job to the degree that they can, but it's never ending. It's like whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Right. There are ideas for solutions going forward, but I think America has to pivot and take a real serious look at who's involved, who's really upstream. That's really the puppet masters pulling the strings in regards to the entire drug trafficking or illicit drug trafficking industry.
When you say upstream, can you elaborate on that, please?
So we in law enforcement, or my prior career, we are very focused on networks that are selling drugs and recovering the funds from that. We're very focused on what's in front of us. So, for example, DEA, FBI, HSI, Marshals, ATF, very focused on going after the cartels in Mexico. Go after Chapo, go after Mayo, go after the Chapitos, go after Mencho. But who's really behind them, allowing them to exist, right? So you have, one of the issues in Mexico is corruption at the local level, at the state level, at the national level. And so that's what I'm referring to, right? So there's that piece that's never been addressed. My hope is that the new president will do that, shine bomb. But you never know. And in regards to China, it's similarly, what's the real issue behind why China? China in May of 2019, Vince, they regulated all variations of fentanyl, but yet they still are subsidizing up to 13% tax rebates to their own companies to export fentanyl into Mexico and the United States. So on one hand, public, they're saying, look, we're controlling fentanyl. On the other hand, they're giving tax rebates to thousands of companies to export it.
It's fascinating.
Right.
Officials are warning of a widespread cybersecurity attack.
Frustrations and delays have continued as countless are still without power.
Market volatility is at its highest since the pandemic.
There are a number of reports across the state.
Unidentified crashing news. There is no doubt our grid is at risk.
The shark is entering airspace.
Earlier, you were talking about the borders. The couple guests I've had have a difference of opinion that cartels are not using illegal immigration to transport drugs. Why they say that is because the numbers prove that a lot of it comes to the ports of entry, and also, you and I know some of the ports outside of that. What are your opinions on that? Are they using illegal immigration in support of their smuggling drugs?
Absolutely. So it's very easy to give one statement, say this is the fact, and the truth is that there's no one line that is factual. So the cartel will use and deploy any means to smuggle drugs, and just because you got to understand what that means along the southwest border, you may have one group that their smuggling method is through the POE, the ports of entry. Another group where their smuggling is just hopping the fence or climbing over a fence and then just muling it in to the United States. Another group may use drones to drop fentanyl in the United States. So the methodologies are various. There's so many different ways to smuggle into the United States. I would be hard pressed to say, hey, there's one method. There is not. There's so many different ways. Just think about what you would do if you wanted to smuggle anything into the country. That's what the cartels would do. And to do it, think about if you have a wave of 10,000 people coming in this direction and you got to move a significant load, you're not going to put that load right on the backs of that group that's going into Laredo.
Yeah.
Right? You're not going to do that. While all the resources are all piled up right there from Border Patrol and CBP to engage with these migrants, you're going to send it to another location, clearly.
Yeah. I've experienced that personally. Just that's how it worked on the borders when I worked as a Border Patrol agent down in Del Rio. You have a big group of 15. At the time, 15 would be an abundance for us. We'd have several agents go down there. That means the whole area is open. Strategically, they know how we work. They watch us just as much as we watch them. Right. They know that, okay, the agents are gone, boom, push. And some of those areas are within 2 minutes of runtime, they're into a house, a safe house, a vehicle, and that drugs or that load that they were carrying is gone. To an extent, at that time, there was a lot more marijuana. And so sometimes they get an 800 to 1,000 pound load gone. Yeah. And that's how it was. It was the cat and mouse game. It was look left as we go right. Right. I know nowadays it's slightly different in the fact that the cartels are making just as much money on transporting human bodies and trafficking them as much as drugs. And I know also with the change of marijuana becoming legal in some states, there's been a shift in the drug, what is more expensive for them or what gives them a better income, I guess. And that would be things like fentanyl or methamphetamines and whatnot.
Right. So I was also a Border Patrol agent, Vince.
Really? I didn't see that in your bio here.
Yes, I was a Border Patrol agent in the mid-90s in Chula Vista. And so I remember vividly, I mean, Chula Vista wasn't really, it was more like a migrant smuggling location. It wasn't so much a drug trafficking location. You'd have to go up more east towards Otay Mesa and other areas or Calexico, and you'd see more drug trafficking. But I was Border Patrol agent for 2.5 years there. So I'm very familiar with how BP operates. And I do think that there's various methodologies, right? And there was a change, certainly with fentanyl. And I wanted to explain that to you because I know you're interested in how did the Chinese role really adapt and change? Well, clearly meth was their foot in the door in Mexico. There are many Chinese groups in Mexico today that are criminal groups in and of themselves. Okay, they are their own enterprise, and they are no longer Chinese Mexicans, they are Mexican Chinese, meaning that they are there for now generations.
Really?
Right? And they've been there for a period of time, and they do work with Sinaloa, CJ&G cartels. Okay? When fentanyl hit, keep in mind, fentanyl, the first time we saw fentanyl in the United States was in 91 to 93. And it led to a cluster of overdose deaths in Chicago and New York on a street. It was called Tango and Cash, the movie. And immediately we were able to zero in on that and find out that it was a chemist and it was a group based out of Ohio. We shut that down. The next time we saw fentanyl was in 2006 in the south side of Chicago. And that was a Sinaloa cartel. And we traced it back to a lab in Toluca, Mexico, shut that lab down, and then it went dormant for a number of years until 2013. 2013, we started seeing fentanyl precursors come into the United States, right? Primarily APNP or 4-APP, which are the precursors for meth production. You add propionyl chloride and you essentially have fentanyl. And then they would mix that with heroin, Mexican heroin, and make it the heroin so much stronger. It was called China White on the streets at the time. This was 2013, 2014. That is when we started pivoting into the Chinese role into synthetics. So we were late in the game, so to speak. We knew that the Chinese had a role in money laundering of Colombian cocaine. We knew that they had a role in precursor chemicals for meth production, but fentanyl really put the huge spotlight on the Chinese role on the drug trade.
Can we not do anything about that now that we know? Is there nothing that the U.S. government can do and say, hey, we're identifying this is connection to China. China, what are you going to do about it?
Sure. I mean, I think there's so much more we could do in China. And I think there's other geopolitical issues, obviously Taiwan, and other issues in regards to China and the State Department and where they see our relationship going. From my perspective, spending 28 years in law enforcement, it's all about saving lives, right? And my focus is American lives. And I know that for a fact that production in China is causing over 100,000 deaths each year in America. And we've already proven that the Chinese government plays a role in exportation of fentanyl into the United States. And we've already proven that when the lockdowns took place, that they have a direct correlation to being able to stop this, right? Or slow this down. I do think, Vince, that there's other areas that require work. So I don't want to just take it from a perspective of purely law enforcement or purely national security. And attacking just the supply chain. I do think that there's a messaging issue, right? Because you have young kids that are taking fentanyl one time and dying. Yeah. And just one pill and dying. Never took it before, first time, and they're passing away. And so that tells me that, okay, well, where's the message getting lost? What do we need to do on this end? And I always equate it to this. You can't burn a candle at one end and expect to really have impact. You got to go at it from both ends. So it has to come at it from supply. You have to go at it from demand, and hopefully you meet in the middle and you have some kind of solution. We can get past this crisis and the numbers will drop substantially.
So when you talk about demand, you're talking about us as a country.
Yes, I am talking about us. Yeah.
And so I'm curious to know, what do you think? How do we fix the demand here? Why are we such a huge demand of these drugs? Why we created almost this market for the cartel themselves and China to even be involved? And how do we slow that down, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, you're going into the sociological, psychological makeup of an American citizen. Everything we do is big homes, big cars, big everything, right? We buy, everything. We're the biggest consumers in the world. And so, unfortunately, that also carries over to other issues, right? But I do think that the solution is going after demand, which is education. It is prevention. It is treatment. It is these other areas where people need help. Listen, addiction, growing up where I grew up in the Bronx, New York, I've known people in my own family that were addicted to drugs. And it's and it's a human thing, right? It's not something where you can point the finger and blame and say, get off drugs. It's easier said than done, right? Yeah. So I think that we have to focus as a nation on both sides to come up with a solution, right? Obviously, from my perspective, the supply is my wheelhouse. I can speak to it. On the prevention, treatment, that other side, there's more that needs to be done, right? More kids need to be aware of the dangers of drugs at a much earlier age, not 12 or 13 or 14. It's too late. I mean, I'm talking 5, 6, 7. That's
really,
yes.
So that reminds me a lot of the DARE program. But forgive me if I'm incorrect on this, but I was told that the DARE program has proven to not be effective.
So the DARE program, which I'm a part of as well, is, again, it's training, right? But it needs money and support to be able to do that. And who are they really training, right? They're training a lot of law enforcement, first responders, educators. I think I'd like to see a place where big Department of Education, HHS, some of the big organizations in the United States get behind training and education and support that nationally. So it's not just privately funded, it's governmentally funded, so that we could tamper this down. And quite frankly, it shouldn't be something that's open-ended. It shouldn't be something where we're paying towards this for the next 10 to 20 years, but it should be something where we're just trying to get a hold of this crisis, get it under control, and then we get some momentum behind it, and we're slowing down this crisis through education and also enforcement of the law.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I have kids, school-age children, and I'm always terrified that, my son's back hurts from wrestling practice, and his friend says, "Hey, here's a pain med that my mom gave me." And that's the last thing you hear. You hear about this happen so often, and it's terrifying raising kids that go to school and, impressionable children. And just when they're young, or even my college kids who might just be experimenting one night and, one too many pills or whatnot, and don't realize it's laced with fentanyl. It's a terrifying thing having kids in this time and hearing those children who take it once and never wake up again. I want to pivot this conversation to the underground banking operations to launder cartel money, and if you could just give the audience a brief explanation of that so far before we go into it more.
So historically, money laundering really, for the most part, was controlled by Colombian organizations. And why is that? That was because they own the product. So cocaine. So that made sense, right? Okay, Colombians own the product. They control the laundering of money through many different means, right? So again, it's not just kind of one size fits all. It's many different ways that they would launder money through the banks, through MSBs or money service providers, just cash, or through goods, many different areas. And what happened was cocaine became a global illicit commodity. So we've seen Colombian cartels now moving into Europe, Spain, Germany, Australia, all throughout the world. So we started seeing cocaine really into Canada. And so we started seeing those markets expand, right? What did the Mexican cartels do? Well, they're no longer needed really necessarily for transport into the United States for cocaine. So they shifted their business plan, their model, towards synthetics, methamphetamine, heroin first, and now fentanyl. And so when you look at those synthetics, why did they go there? So much more lucrative. So much more lucrative.
Yeah.
Let me explain this so that your audience knows this. If I was up in the mountains of Sinaloa and I ran a poppy cultivation field, maybe 3 acres, and I'm growing poppy, it'd take me about 4 months to fully cultivate that, and then take that paste and refine it into heroin, and I may get 2 kilos of heroin out of it. Right. So you're dependent on the weather, you're dependent on secrecy, you're dependent on all these things. Right. And so now you pivot into synthetics. That's all out the window. You now have a synthetic opioid that is 50 times more powerful than heroin, 100 times more powerful than morphine, and you have a limitless supply of chemicals. And at the time when fentanyl hit, it only cost per kilo, 1 kilo of fentanyl was $3,000. Now that 1 kilo of fentanyl was being turned into, around 2015 is when we started seeing the pills come out of Mexico. That one pill of fentanyl, maybe 2 to 4 milligrams of fentanyl, was being sold in Boston Northeast for about $30 a pill. So when you look at the markup, 1 kilo, $3,000, one pill, and maybe you generate 250, 300,000 pills from that 1 kilo, you're looking at an $8 million, $9 million return.
Damn.
So the cartels were like, okay, we're either, you're losing, not that they couldn't buy more cocaine, but cocaine was now shifting worldwide. Okay. So, and the Mexican heroin, black tar heroin, and brown heroin, it wasn't as powerful. Even Colombian heroin was stronger. And so what did they do? And Sinaloa did this, by the way. It was the Sinaloa cartel. Added the fentanyl to the heroin to make it stronger. The money. Now, this is where I wanted to give you a foundation understanding of why it's so lucrative and why the push is for synthetics, right? Now, let's talk about how that money has changed from 2013 to the present. Well, as I mentioned, when you follow the drugs, you know who controls the money laundering. Cocaine, it was Colombian organizations. By the way, there's also now Balkan groups. So there's different Balkan groups in Ecuador and South America that are now very much entrenched, moving cocaine to Europe and West Africa. So that's shifted, okay? But let me put that aside for a second. You go into fentanyl and the fentanyl money, what we immediately saw was that when I was a special agent in charge, even just an agent in New York, we started seeing that these local distribution crews, fentanyl distribution crews, were bringing cash to Chinese nationals in the streets. They didn't speak the language, but they would show a code off of a dollar bill and say, hey, this is the code, verified. And they would pass, hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars to a Chinese national. A lot of these Chinese nationals were students here on student visas. And they would take that cash and they would go to get consolidated in the stash location. And then that would go to a money broker that is working with a Chinese contract, both out of China and Mexico City, to pick up that drug money. As soon as the drug money is picked up, the money is released in Mexico City back to the cartel. Almost instantaneous. They call it espejos. You know that, mirrors. So very, very quick. And so why it got so skilled, they got so skilled at doing it, is because the Chinese VIG, or the cost to launder the money, dropped down to 1%, and in some cases 0. They didn't charge anything to launder the money. And even when we seized the money, right, we saw a transaction, we seized the money and take the money, the Chinese criminal group, will pay the money out to the cartel anyway. Damn. And the reason why they could do that is because they're making so much money on the money that they're getting. And I want to explain that too. So you have these money brokers in key cities throughout the United States that are Chinese, and they're affiliated to Chinese organized crime.
In America?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they're affiliated to Chinese organized crime and different groups. So it's not just, people say immediately triads or snakeheads. No, there are affiliations directly to Chinese organized crime in America. And that money will go to these groups, and they have many different methodologies of laundering. But one of the key things that they would do is buy American goods with it. So they'll give, they'll pick 10 people, give everyone $10,000. You go into the store, get everything in this store. You go into the store, get everything in this store. Take all these goods, aggregate them, put them in a container, and ship them to Guangzhou. And now those same American goods that were priced at this now get a 200-300% markup.
Yeah.
So they're making money on top of their investment. So even when they lose money through seizures or other means, they're still paying out the cartel. So it's hard to defeat. And that's, I don't want you to think that that's the only methodology. They do use banks. They do move cash. They do use money service providers. So there's other methodologies.
Can I ask some? During my time I remember we would do operations called southbound traffic, and we were trying to stop some of the cash that comes across, some of the guns that come across.
Right.
And what became a new thing for us was these prepaid debit cards. And I'm talking by the thousands, bags of those. Was that another way of their doing money laundering?
Yes. So again, so there's no, I hate to, it's limitless almost, right? So we used to see those as well. Now it's cryptocurrency. Quite frankly, now it's all crypto. So think about it. We'll see a group that's a fentanyl group in New York City deliver cash to someone who's in a Chinese organized criminal network, then deliver it to a Russian network that is involved with cryptocurrency laundering. And so you have these various transnational groups operating in the United States to launder millions and millions of dollars and do it expeditiously outside of the country very fast. So it's not one dimensional. It's multi-dimensional, and it's many different ways that they do it. It's very adaptable.
Yeah. And so knowing that, how challenging is it for government organizations like the DEA to try and stop this or identify it, slow it down, anything?
Yeah, I think it is tremendously challenging. And this is what I'll say about that. I've seen a pullback in U.S. attorneys' offices' willingness to go after hardcore drug trafficking organizations like they used to. There's many stories where individuals were arrested with double digits amounts of fentanyl and released the next day, right? And would go back to their country of origin and never to be seen again. So we've kind of taken a step back, in my opinion, not everywhere, but in certain areas where we see this kind of like, well, you know what, drugs is a human condition. We shouldn't be so hard on these drug dealers. And by the way, there was no violence attributed to the fact that, you just transported 25 kilos of fentanyl, but you have no violence record. Well, you know what, we're going to let you out on your own recognizance. That's nonsense, right? Just by virtue of the fact, as deadly as fentanyl is, it's not going to stop unless we take a much harder approach to this, in my opinion.
How do we start to change this, dismantle this, make an effect on that side from the DEA perspective? What are some of the harsher punishments that you'd like to see that are implemented that maybe makes an impact?
That's a great question, Vince. So I think that we need to strengthen our laws, especially nationally, our federal laws, to give us a little bit more latitude to go after the backbone of these transnational organized crime groups.
Really? So what does that look like?
That looks like if you're a cartel or you're being supported by an official in Mexico, then we need to look at if that law that is available to us, if it's strong enough or not, or can we create another one that would give us a little bit more latitude to hold them accountable for their support in trafficking and distribution in the United States. That's one area that I would look at. The other area I would look at is, I think that we have to do a much better job of sharing intelligence across the federal agencies. No matter what, 9/11 did teach us a lesson, but the lesson, I don't see where it really held the way that it needs to hold, right? We are still very much tied to our own individual missions, right, as agencies. And I do think that there needs to be a whole of government approach to solving a particular problem like this. My hope is that things will move forward towards this. There are places like Special Operations Division where there is a lot of sharing of intelligence, but I think we need to do it at scale. And agencies, again, as it is micro, we need to go macro, put the egos aside, go after the problem, come up with a strategy that will impact it at many different levels, and then put the resources behind it to impact it. And then have a standard of metrics that we are measuring as we go along the path towards impacting this problem.
And when you said harsher punishments, you're talking not just on people transporting, but the drug dealers themselves. And if in the case where we can identify some transnational organization working in the United States, give them harsher punishment as well.
Yeah, I think, listen, I don't want to sound or come off like I am, I understand that there are people that get into drug distribution at the lowest level for many different reasons, right? I've come across many people where I've arrested or been in a room when they were arrested, and you would never imagine the type of people that get into distribution. And quite frankly, some people are not bad people, right? They're not evil. But I do think that there's a level of responsibility where you have to hold people accountable, right? So if you're selling fentanyl and that fentanyl causes someone to die, right, that's a homicide. So what should happen to you?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You've just caused death.
Right. You just caused death. So I think that there has to be an area where we are holding people accountable. And this is the ultimate reason, because they're victims. Who's the real victim? Is the person selling the victim, or the person that just died and their family the victim?
Yeah, the
right?
addict. The addict who has trouble controlling their cravings.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Right. So their addiction led to their death, but who's impacted? Their friends, their family, their neighborhoods, their community, their town. So with that being said, I think that we need to get back to a place where we're all collaborating, coordinating, but we're also holding people accountable. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned you don't necessarily want to talk about, as in focus too much on, how the drugs come in, and focus more on us as well as we're the demand. But when you focus on the cartel and you hopefully slow that down, is there a world in your head where we could potentially start doing cross-border operations and supporting Mexico in their efforts to kind of dismantle cartel?
Absolutely. So there was a time where we worked so closely with the Mexican Marines. Mexican Marines are national treasures for Mexico. And I really mean that. They are a top-notch organization, truly patriotic Mexican nationals, and really put their lives on the line for their country. And DEA had a robust partnership with them. I'd like to see that develop again and go back to a place where we are collaborating closely, not just DEA, but all of our components and all of their components, right? To a place where we are cross-border sharing intelligence, holding some of these organizations down, accountable, and then really impacting them for change. Is my opinion. There's a history of this, Vince, and because we've already done this, we can do this again.
What changed? When you guys had a good relationship, everything good? Was it a political shift that changed? Was it something, a case that kind of destroyed the relationship? What was it?
The current administration in Mexico adapted.
In Mexico.
That's right. The current administration in Mexico adapted the slogan of hugs, not bullets.
Absolutely.
And so it immediately impacted our ability to share information. Immediately, we saw the number of clandestine labs that there was a time we were intercepting or taking down. When I say we, I really mean DEA or FBI or HSI intelligence, identifying a lab, so working with our counterparts, the Marines or the vetted units that we had there, or the Army, and they would take down these labs. There was a time we were taking down over 100 labs a year. That trickled down to single digits under the current administration.
Yeah, you and I know the corruption that happens in Mexico is questionable, how far those hands are into their own government. I don't want to say it is, but you and I know that this was the most brutal election year that they've had. From a lot of candidates were getting killed, and almost in an effort to almost pick and choose who they wanted to become president. Yeah. Right. And this new president coming in, I'm very curious to see. I know her ideologies are very similar to the current president, but she does have kind of a different approach go, please.
I agree. So I think she does have, listen, I don't want to speak for her or her administration, but outside looking in, I think she does have differing opinion on the rule of law and upholding the rule of law. And so we've seen that with her in Mexico City. And the hope is that she will take a stronger position. I understand that she's part of the AMLO administration, or she came in under that umbrella. That's a sovereign nation, respect Mexico. But what we see is both Mexican citizens and American citizens suffering because of the cartels. And so what can we do, two nations collaborating to go after this problem? Well, I can tell you what we could do. Well, here's a mutual problem. Chinese organized crime, groups that are well established in Mexico. We can go after them collectively, right? That are laundering. This is what I was going to say to you. And I got sidetracked, but I want to bring this back. The biggest money launderers in the world right now in drugs in this side of the world are Chinese organized criminal groups working for the cartels. Okay. So the days of just being suppliers of precursor chemicals, yes, they do that at scale. But now they are more and more the biggest money launderers in the world. They also are, and nationally and throughout the United States, the biggest groups behind black market marijuana, Chinese organized criminal groups. And so that's a mutual area where we can collaborate, US and Mexico, that we can go after these bad actors that are in Mexico and in the United States, quite frankly, and hold them accountable.
It's wild to think how strong the cartels become in Mexico, and also their connections with China and other transnational organizations. The way the trafficking is going currently right now, is there, and this is strictly your opinion, is there a belief or talks of the potential hands of the cartel being in our own U.S. government?
No. I don't think it's. I know Mexico or Mexican cartels are not in the United States government. I'll show you where there is impact though. Policy is impacted, and I'm going to explain that to you. Okay, there was a time where DEA arrested a Mexican general in the army of Mexico. He flew into California. He was arrested. 4 days later, he was released back to Mexico.
Yeah.
So what's the bigger issue for us? Well, I think there's two issues. One is national security. Two is the unbelievable amount of commerce that both nations share with one another. And so there are higher issues that the government will weigh and determine what makes more sense for the United States. So when you say, are there cartels play a role inside the government? No, but certainly those bad actors that are supporting the cartel are often or sometimes political officials.
Yeah.
And so that line does get blurred.
That's a great point, and I never thought of that, because there's also talks of the potential of El Mayo having a connection to CIA, or if not being, an informant for them, and is why he probably gave himself up or whatnot. But in the event of maintaining certain relationships, yes, I can see certain things kind of getting almost swept over the rug, or using policies to kind of adhere other law.
Yeah, I mean, what's the higher priority for a nation, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. What's the number one priority coming out of the State Department? It's more food for thought, but yeah, that's what the issue is. And from my perspective, and I'm sure from your perspective, I mean, we come at it from, hey, I just want to save lives. I want to do my mission. I want to focus on, I want to create change. But that's also coming at it from a granular level, right? Because it's like, this is our vision of what it looks like. The State Department's going to look at our national security and they're going to weigh what makes sense for the nation. So they have a different approach, and I'm not knocking them. I appreciate what they do. But I also feel like we have to do something, the whole of government, to go after this problem internationally, because we can't just do it in the United States.
Yeah. Recently, the CBP released numbers of, and don't quote me exactly on this, something close to 32 Chinese nationals coming into the country illegally. Does that have a connection, in your opinion, to some of the smuggling or, kind of the infrastructure being built inside of the United States?
So this is my opinion. This is not based on anything in particular, but having been a Border Patrol agent and been DEA for many years and worked the border and been in Mexico for many, many years, in and out of Mexico. My belief is that the Chinese nationals, most of them single men, individuals, there is a portion of that group that are intel officers coming into the nation. That's just purely my belief based on my background, on my experience. Now, is it the vast majority of them? No, I don't think so. But they're paying a lot of money to the cartel to get smuggled all the way from South America into the Darien Gap, all the way up to Mexico, directly into the United States. Now, when you put that aside, and I mentioned to you, Vince, that there are groups of Chinese organized criminal groups, that there are actual criminal networks that also smuggle Chinese nationals into the United States, but they also do it by legal means, right? Mm. They do it by legal means too. So they'll say, okay, here's a work visa. Here's a student visa. We're going to put you're part of the criminal group, but we're going to get you in on a work visa. And they'll send them up to places like Sacramento, and you're going to go, or Colorado or Oklahoma. You're going to work this marijuana farm until you pay off the cost that it took to get you over here. So the next 10, 15 years. So we've seen legal use to bring in Chinese nationals, but clearly we've seen also the underground, the criminal groups that are literally internationally pushing Chinese national into Ecuador, into Mexico, and then into the United States.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We had an interview with a gentleman who lived on the border of Yucumba out there in San Diego. And
okay.
He recovered over 1,000 ID cards and passports of Chinese nationals. And at the time, they were using that opportunity to hide their identity so that China wouldn't take them back in a deportation case, and which we found extremely fascinating. Is that bring any thoughts to mind?
Yeah, it does. I see. So Chinese organized crime is very interesting, right? You know, again, even in the criminal world, these groups think long term. They don't think next year, 2 years, 3, 4, 5 years from now. They think 10, 20, 30 years from now. So that how they perform and operate is very interesting. They'll establish a criminal network, start making money. Before you know it, the next thing they'll establish is some kind of business association. And so now you have the Chinese Business Association of this province. And then where do you see the crossover with CCP? Oftentimes in that area. So you'll see CCP members that are in Mexico visiting with these business associations. You'll hear, I'm sure you heard about this Belt and Road initiatives, right? So the Belt and Road initiatives, you know, billions and billions of dollars being pushed out of China on behalf of these countries to build bridges, tunnels, and the like. And a lot of times behind that, we'll see money laundering at scale, much like really high level. And we'll see criminal elements that are connected to these networks. And so that's where you see that integration between the criminal world and then the government officials as it relates to Chinese criminal networks, especially in South America, Central America, and Mexico. It leads me to my point about my belief is that you're going to have a small portion of these individuals that are coming in that are purely intel officers. And make no mistakes about it, there are others all throughout the United States. I mean, look what just happened in New York with Governor Hochul, where you had one of her right aides was arrested by the FBI and indicted by the Eastern District of New York as being a spy for the Chinese government. And you know, and that's what you have. So there's story after story of this happening, and for the most part, many of these people, many of the Chinese intelligence officers are highly educated, highly sophisticated. They're in communities. They've been here for many, many years, and they're dormant, and they slowly access different groups before they are within a group. And whether they try to sway opinion or by other means move, you know, a political party in one direction versus another. We see this happen all the time, Vince.
Last question. And then again, if there's anything else you want to give the audience, you're more than welcome to. But we're coming up too close to the election. I asked this to my last guest. I'd like to ask you, which administration do you believe would have a harder policy or a tougher policy against the smuggling and that would help America in this situation?
So I think that the Trump administration would have certainly a more rigid policy. But then again, I see President Trump as a negotiator. And so I'm sure that he would leverage that for some kind of win-win situation. I do think that we need, as a nation, need to address all these fundamental issues. But again, I speak from a law enforcement perspective. I don't want to speak on behalf of national security, the council, or Department of State. But I do think that a Trump administration would push a lot of this forward, and we saw some of it, right, in this previous administration. I can't tell you that. That's a whole nother world of politics, and I still tend to stay away from that. I'm an independent personally. I see wins and losses in both sides, to be honest with you, Vince. So I think most Americans are somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
And that's my belief, right?
Thank you for listening to Borderland, an Ironclad original. Don't forget to share with your friends and let them know. Thank you so much. Take care.